Okay, everybody see the slides?
Yes.
All right, then I'm ready to go. Just tell me when.
Go ahead.
All right, so hi there. My name is David Karger. I'm a professor in the computer science department at MIT and also a part-time visiting faculty researcher at Google. I've been working for many years at MIT on misinformation and trust, and a recent W3C meeting led to a serendipitous encounter with Jeff Yaski and Rick Byers and Emily Stark, which is kind of amusing because we're all at Google. They suggested that it would be a good idea for me to present this 15 minutes about the projects we've been working on at MIT as a kind of thought provocation for thinking about how we might want to incorporate trust and assessment onto the web. And so what I'm going to be telling you about is work that was the PhD thesis of my graduate student, Farnaz Jahanbakhsh, who is hopefully on the call or will be shortly. And we also collaborated with another one of my previous students, Amy Zhang, who's now at the University of Washington. So I'm going to be talking about misinformation as the motivating problem. And there's not much that people in the United States agree about right now, but I think there's almost 100% agreement that half of the people in the country are completely misinformed about the state of the world. So misinformation is a pretty serious problem. And I always like to start with a summary of what I'm hoping to give you in the talk. And that is that trust in others is fundamental, how we decide what we believe. It's the main pathway to our model of the world. That current online platforms ignore this trust relationship. And if we don't fix that, we're going to be drowned by misinformation. And that we need to empower individuals, not just platforms, but individuals and organizations to make their own choices about which sources of information they trust, to attach their own assessments of accuracy to content that they know well, and to ignore content that their trusted sources consider inaccurate. I don't need to spend a lot of time talking to this group about misinformation and its problems. We've seen really serious misinformation situations with real world impact. Just because it's not always thought of as misinformation, I want to flag the bottom right, review bombing. I see review bombing as sort of micro misinformation where lots and lots of people are generating small bits of information, but I also put that into the misinformation category. And everybody recognizes this is a problem, and most people just say that the platforms should fix it. There are governments demanding it, there are NGOs demanding it. My thesis is that they can't. The platforms are large, but they're tiny compared to the scale of the web and of misinformation generally. And so they can't do it. And even if they could, they shouldn't, because there's no consensus on what misinformation is. It's been very interesting living in the United States, watching how stuff that was misinformation 10 months ago is no longer misinformation. It's now true, just because we have different politicians in power. So that's not a good way to try to deal with misinformation. We don't want politicians to decide. We certainly don't want the platforms to decide. They have their own biases and self-interest. And it is just a fact, and one that we verified through a lot of our research, that nobody is trusted by everyone, and nobody should be. And certainly the platforms are not trusted by many people at all. Trust is our primary source of knowledge. I recommend this book that one of my colleagues recently published about the social construction of knowledge, right? That very few of us have gone out and checked those weather station records for the past 50 years to decide whether climate change is actually happening. We believe it because of who we have heard it from. And unfortunately, the web does not really adequately materialize this in any sort of machine processable way, and we need to fix that. So what we explored in our research is a trust-centric approach where we let anyone, any individual, any organization, any site declare what is accurate and what is inaccurate, and attach those assessments to any content on the web. We consciously give everyone autonomy to decide who to trust. And we then use that to help people filter their own incoming information. We show them information that is verified by people and sources that they trust, or help them ignore information that isn't verified. A lot of our work played out through a website called TrustNet and a browser extension, the TrustNet browser extension, which we have just gotten republished on the Chrome store and is working for at least some people. We'll try and get it working for everybody within the next few days. The TrustNet site is a lot like, it's sort of a prototype social website where you have a news feed, but things in the feed can be marked by any user as accurate or inaccurate. And then the TrustNet browser brings those assessments to wherever you encounter those pages on the web, and not only in your news feed. So this is the TrustNet website. This is where you go in order to record the sources that you trust. As I said, they can be individuals, or, which is marked in yellow, or organizations, which are marked in blue. And here's a video of the TrustNet extension in action. When you visit a web page, you can pop open something that allows you to assess the content as accurate or inaccurate, and you can optionally provide reasoning for that, although that's not the focus of our work. Once you have done so and submitted your assessment, anybody who visits this page and trusts you will receive that assessment when they arrive. If the page is trusted, we just have a little green mark in the corner, which you can pop open for the full assessment. But if the page is not trusted, if the page has been assessed as inaccurate, then you will get this big red pop-up saying, watch out. Equally importantly, because a lot of people don't actually click through on links, we show those assessments on fragments of a page that link to content which has been assessed. So here you see a green check mark next to a headline that leads to an article that has been assessed as accurate, and a red X on a headline that has been assessed as inaccurate. We also fade out the inaccurate headlines in order to reduce their salience. But we don't hide them entirely, because we want people to have the opportunity to choose to ignore the assessments that are coming from the browser extension. Here, again, you can see here's a Twitter feed. And again, our browser extension is noticing links to articles that have been assessed and fading the inaccurate ones and putting green check marks next to the accurate ones. Here's the same thing happening on Google News. And we also provided functionality for doing the same with YouTube playlists. This, of course, has to be done one aggregator site at a time, which is not scalable, and I think is one of the interesting opportunities for thinking about standards and browser technology to make this work web-wide. I'll come back to that at the end. We went a little farther. We built a tool called Reheadline, which doesn't just have you flagging misinformation, but actually lets you fix it. And we focused on the headlines because it's known that many people don't bother clicking through and just get their information from headlines and then share that information. So with the Reheadline extension, anyone who finds an inaccurate headline can replace it. Again, you only see these replacements from sources that you trust, because there's going to be lots of malicious people replacing headlines that we don't want you to pay any attention to. And again, this replacement occurs anywhere the headline appears on the web. So here we have an example of that. It's not playing itself, but you basically, when you encounter a headline, you highlight it, you suggest an alternative, and whenever somebody else is browsing the web, then alternatives that are suggested by people that they trust replace the original headlines. Again, we've chosen to show the original headline crossed out in order to not be accused of hiding information from users, but this is an interesting design decision that can be explored further. That's a demonstration of what we do. Let's talk about objections, concerns, and challenges. We always get objections about scale. How could I find enough trusted sources to assess the entire web? Well, I think it's worth remembering that my trusted sources have their own trusted sources and so on. And so we should consider propagating assessment through this trust network. That's not something we did in our experiments. And exactly how to do it is a great research problem because, of course, it's an error-prone propagation. Mistakes are going to happen. And so we have to think about how to do error correction in that propagation. Some people ask whether anybody actually wants this. Who wants to do all the fact checking? Who wants to see the fact checks? According to our surveys, which are of course limited in scope, there are many people who are already trying to get fact checks, doing it the hard way, emailing things to their friends or to relatives, asking for fact checks. There are people checking the fact checking websites. There are people who are eager to provide fact checks if they can get those fact checks to people who will benefit from them. There are fact checking organizations that exist. And I think that this is where journalists should be pivoting to. That is on top of just reporting new news. I think it's also fits in very well with their skills and responsibilities to be fact checking other news sites. The fact is that tons of fact checking work already happens, but it's not accessible. It's in a comment on a post. And so thinking about how to surface that for general use will, I think, do a lot to help us deal with misinformation. Another objection that I get is about filter bubbles. Isn't this just going to empower conspiracy theorists to talk to each other and never trust the right people? And I think the answer is yes, but ethically, this may be something that we have to do, right? People have a right to autonomy. And if they want to decide to ignore certain people and pay attention to other people, that is their right. There's some interesting articles on the right against compelled listening, right? Nobody should be able to force people to listen to stuff. There's also practical considerations. Fine, maybe we can force people to listen, but if they don't trust the speaker, they won't trust, then it won't help that they're listening. And that includes the platforms. Very few people trust the platforms. So I think that if we are able to capture trust and assessment, then what we can do is find assessments from people that they do trust to try to change their minds, to bring them out of these conspiracy theories. And we can also use this tracked information to help them realize that they should not trust certain sources that they are trusting, because those sources are often making wrong assessments. AI is coming, and I think that makes things much worse. So far, we've relied on some heuristics that have served pretty well in sort of biological history, right? If something is well written, or if we see something that has been recorded in video, or if the majority of people believe something to be true, they're not always reliable, but they've been pretty good as heuristics. But with AI, I think all of this is doomed, right? LLMs are able to generate beautiful text and videos that are indistinguishable from real. And with unbounded number of AIs, we're going to have, astroturfing, where most of the voters are not human. And so majority voting also won't be reliable. I have to have a way to say that, yes, I like majority voting, but only by the people that I trust. So in fact, I think this means we need to pivot. Our old notion is that, well, most of the web is trustworthy, except we want to have ways of detecting the parts that are not. I think we should actually be heading towards a web where, by default, nothing is trusted. And then we think about ways to bring the trusted part of the web into view for us. AI can help, right? We can use AI to scale fact checking, right? If somebody makes an assessment on one article, then AI can help propagate that assessment to all the other articles that make the same claims. There are risks of incorrect transition, right? So we, again, have to think about the potential for errors, but I think AI could help scale here, but only if used properly. I'll finish with some open questions. This is a conference for the browser and for the infrastructure. So what plays out there, right? So what do we want to put into the infrastructure to support this kind of interaction? Do we want, giant repositories where people record their trust relationships and their assessments? Or do we want to think more like the search engines, where there are trust engines that crawl the web for people's assessments and trust notations and aggregate it for use? what sort of standards can we define? So, information moves through the web. Can we reliably track its provenance so that an assessment that was placed on a page somewhere can follow that page around as people copy and paste the content from it? There are important privacy considerations, right? I think there are real dangers to making people's trust or assessments public. Or even if not dangers, then it can create really bad social pressures for people to claim to trust the wrong people. There's also the problem that assessment queries going out to the repositories of trust are going to reveal browsing history. So we have to think about how to protect people's privacy. How do we deal, it's going to be a real problem if I have to send my query to thousands of competing trust services in order to find out whether I should trust a page. So how do we avoid fragmentation? Is this something that we want commercial entities to be trying to do, or do we just want some big centralized trusted source like DNS? How are bad actors going to attack this infrastructure is a pretty obvious question. With respect to the browser, I showed you that TrustNet did whole page interactions where it just sort of assessed the entire page, but also in-page interactions where we had a feed and you needed to assess lots of different elements that came from many places. Whole page is the low-hanging fruit, right? That's something that you can do outside of the page in the browser margins, for example, and where you only need to issue one query in order to assess the page. With a feed, there's problems with scaling, right? There's tons of URLs in the page that you may need to get assessments for. And there's also questions of what is the boundaries, like, who gets what power to change the page based on assessments that some information in the page is inaccurate, which of course the site serving the page probably doesn't even want you to know. How do we deal with redirections, right? So this is a problem we ran into in TrustNet, that there's a link on the page, but you have to follow through a huge chain of redirections to find the content, which slows everything down. And what do we do if everybody gets a different URL for the same content? How do we make sure that the assessments follow the content and are not limited to the URL? With embedded content, right? How do we get an identifier for the embedded content that, again, lets us associate with the assessments that are on the underlying content that created the embed, right? What do we do about the fact that people paste these graphics that contain a quotation from some article somewhere else, which may be completely fabricated? How do we tie that back to the article in order to say that, yes, this quotation really was in the article and people that you trust say that this article is accurate? How do we get this adopted, right? There's a cold start an obvious cold start problem that if nobody is making assessments, then there's no benefit to installing the extension. Perhaps we can start with some fact-checking sites or some news organizations and convince them to start making assessments in the hope that this will eventually lead people to consume them. What parts of this work should be done within Chromium and what parts of this work should be done as standards within W3C? I'll stop there, right? We're currently asking the platforms to deal with misinformation cleanup. This is something that instead needs to be delivered to individuals and organizations. But in order to do that, we have to figure out how to actually represent trust and assessment in ways that are machine readable, machine manipulable, and can be incorporated into the browser in the right way. And I'll stop there. As I mentioned, this is collaborative work with two of my now ex-students, Farnaz Jahanbakhsh at University of Michigan and Amy Zhang at the University of Washington. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David.
So what do people here think?
I have a question. How do you deal with the cases where for example, two trusted sources, they have conflict ideas?
Farnaz, do you want to take that?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Well, we show the conflict. I think this is actually like a case that has to be highlighted. And that probably also, results in you reconsidering your opinions or reconsidering your trust network.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great at the start to know that there's a conflict, that maybe you need to look into this more carefully, that maybe it's worthwhile you contributing your assessment because this is conflicted. And also, as Farnaz says, it's a great opportunity to say, should I trust both of these people? one of them is wrong. So maybe I should look into that and decide who it is.
I
See Ben and then someone here.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting talk. Thank you for presenting this. I was curious. It seems to me in order to have your trust relationships available to you, such that you're doing the things you are, it's like, all right, now you have to essentially be signed into a service.
Mhm.
Is this sort of leading towards you need to be signed in to something? You know, like if this is built into the browser, do you need to be signed into Google Chrome in order to get this? Like, is this leading towards like you need to be signed in to something somewhere in order to safely navigate the web? I think that's something we've been resistant to in the past in terms of a centralization on the web. And I'm just curious if
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I was asking about in terms of whether we want a central, like what kind of centralization or distribution do we want, right? Is it a centralized service? Is it search engine type things where there are many competing aggregators of information, but you can choose which of them you want to use? And yes, as soon as you're signed into a service, there's all these privacy concerns about what you're sharing with the service, about your browsing activity and so forth, so that it can tell you what is safe. I do feel that we're kind of pushed that way because of the scale of the web, right? I mean, you could imagine some gossip protocols and things, right? I get to a web page and I send out a call to all of my other trusted sources that happen to be online at the same time to see if any of them is holding an assessment. But I mean, I think that would be very hard to do without any centralization at all. And so the question is, I mean, DNS would also be hard to do without centralization, right? So can we figure out which piece has to be centralized and keep the rest of it as distributed as possible?
Can I follow up on that? Like it does strike me we have other problems where if we were centralized in some ways, it would make them easier, like anti-fraud and abuse. If we know you're a real person with a real trust relationship, maybe, some of the anti-fraud and abuse people don't need to fingerprint you, because you have that trust relationship built in. On the other hand, I mean, I guess it gets to like, can you trust someone just because they have a TrustNet account, or is it possible they're like a
Oh yeah, I
foreign
certainly would not trust someone.
government,
I certainly would not trust someone because they have a TrustNet account. And I think that if we are thinking about centralization, what we need is like, it is not about trusting the assessments of the centralized entity. It is about trusting the centralized entity to obey a contract of delivering assessments from the people you trust to you. So it really is that centralized entity is a communication medium. It is not a decision maker for you.
So it is not necessarily validated that I am Ben Kelly who lives in the state of New York with like this identity. It's not an identity provider in that sense.
I don't think so. I mean, you might be an anonymous entity depositing your assessments on the centralized server. What's important is that, Farnaz has decided that you, with your anonymized identifier, is one of the sources that you trust. And Farnaz is going to tell this centralized entity, when I'm asking for assessments, pass along assessments from this anonymous ID.
Can I add on to this too? Avoiding politics as much as possible. It's known that government bodies have been interfering in elections. There have been major pushes to spread misinformation intentionally, done by real people and done by bots. And so if we're propagating trusts, I have concern that it only takes one person with hundreds of bot accounts to become a friend with me online, somebody I'm chatting with who I think is a real trustable human, to then give credit to something hugely inaccurate with their 100 bot accounts as their, trusted network.
Well,
so some sort of identity would need to be tied to the process somehow, right? Like I don't know, I'm not suggesting a solution here, but I feel like we would need to verify that these are humans who, I don't even want to, the web is global, right? So I don't want to say like we're not allied nations, so I can't trust this person's opinion on a topic. It feels it feels hard to, the propagating trust part feels really scary to me.
Well, so I think there are different ways to think about propagating trust. And actually, I try not to draw the distinction between human and bot as the main distinction, because I think you can have an untrustworthy human and I think you can have a trustworthy bot. I would actually like to see the emergence of, an AI-powered website that offers assessments, which I can then decide whether I want to trust that website or not. Now, I think that the propagation may happen from how that site decides on its own assessments, right? It may decide that it trusts a certain collection of sources. It may have its own specialized algorithms for aggregating the assessments of those sources and turn that into its own assessment. I think it's very important to create an infrastructure where I can then get the information I need to decide if I want to trust that particular source I don't think it's possible for me to know exactly how it's getting its assessments based on its trusted sources.
I think perhaps another lever that we can pull there is to model how trust travels, right? It could also be the case that trust actually decays after, a certain distance.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if someone else had their hand up, but just following up on that, I think it's an interesting question if, do we develop trust, and should we develop trust purely on the outputs of the other entity? I feel like in non-internet space, in the real world, oftentimes it's like, I know this person, like their family member, that imbues a certain amount of trust. Maybe they're my crazy uncle and I don't trust them, but that's, I've learned. But like they have a baseline of trust because they're a family member. I know their background. They went to, this university. I know this is like a topic they study or not, and I do feel like that is really hard. That baseline of trust based on like your greater knowledge of the person is very hard to establish on the internet.
Oh, I agree. And again, how trust is established is out of band for this presentation. Right? We say you choose your trusted sources, right? Not how you decide to trust them. Now, I do think that we can deliver information to help you make that decision, right? This is what this person has assessed in the past. So TrustNet has an immutable record of assessments, right? You can change your assessment, but we can see that you had one previously, right? So you can actually check somebody's record to decide if you want to trust them. Just to make this even more complicated, Amy Brookman, who published that book I mentioned, always raises this concern that, there's somebody who she totally trusts on allergies, but doesn't trust at all on politics, right? And so you may need actually topic dependent trust. I recognize that we may ultimately have to go there, but I'm always drawn to this. For those of you who read Stranger in a Strange Land, this crazy idea of a fair witness, of just somebody who reports honestly what they know and what they don't know. And like, for me, that's what I would aspire to creating in our culture, is this notion of who can be trusted to be a fair witness, to not speak about things that they don't know.
So I'm on the queue, and then there's a couple others. I wanted to add 2 thoughts on things that came up previously, which were that the question of how do I name other people and kind of read their assessments sounds like the problem that ActivityPub is attacking. And so maybe we already have a system that kind of lets you do that first hop, and like it could be hosted on a server that you pick that then pulls in from everywhere else. So as an option. And then thinking about the I trust someone and they make up 100 people that they claim to trust. Mm-hmm. I feel like my one vote for that person means that all of their trust relations count as one vote. And then if I trust a second person who votes the opposite way, then
it's a tie.
Those balance out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Instead of counting all of the bots independently. Mm-hmm. But that was just thoughts. Gao Shu is next.
Yes. Kind of, I'm curious, all we are talking here is either trust or not trust, because there are something, it's kind of between those two. And people can change, people can make mistakes, and as time goes, information right now is trustable, can be proved it's wrong in the future. So I'm curious, how do you deal with those complicated cases?
Yeah, I think that there's a real cultural issue. I think one of the most corrosive problems culturally that we're facing now is this phenomenon where as soon as somebody makes one mistake, people decide they're not trustworthy, right? And that's a cultural problem. And it's just wrong, right? We have to convince people that even trustworthy people make mistakes some of the time. And that has to be baked into our algorithms and also just our social processes for deciding what's true and what's not, right? So, you know, what I presented today is not a complete solution, right? It's just a starting point that simplifies a lot of pieces that are eventually going to have to be looked at in a more complicated way. And so, you know, we chose a binary notion of trust and a binary notion of assessment. It'd be, you know, it might be natural to say, you know, I trust this person a lot, I trust this person a little. I'm very confident about this assessment. I have some level of confidence about this assessment. I think all of that could enhance, unless it makes it so complicated that people can't deal with it.
So I'm going to jump in for Christian and then go through the rest of the queue. They ask, if I trust 5 people and they have different assessments, how does that get shown?
Farnos, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so we actually show that as a disagreement. So there are like very distinct signals for that. And that is to essentially attract your opinion to the fact that there is disagreement on this piece of content and who the disagreement is coming from.
Yeah, and so you can look, I mean, this is one of the reasons we allow people to record reasons, right? Is that if you see a disagreement, you can go in and look at what reasons they associated with their different assessments. Also, just reminded to mention that another thing that you can do with this tool is ask for assessments. If you see something and you're not sure if it's true, you can indicate that you would like an assessment, and that a request for that goes anonymously to the people that you trust.
So we're over time, so I'm going to finish out the queue and then let everyone go to lunch. Kohei?
Yeah. So I have a friend who is a maths expert who comments on that, like, they may comment on medical topics. I trust their judgment on complicated math forms, and I have a high trust. I might not agree with how they think about a medical issue. So, like, how can we incorporate this in the topics of expertise versus areas that I might not have a full trust on?
Yeah, this comes right back to the question of topic-specific trust that we discussed a little while ago. And again, my dream of where I would like to get to is an ecosystem where people only comment on the stuff that they're trusted on. Like the most trustworthy people are the ones that you can trust to only comment, to only make assessments when they really are trustworthy. People who can introspect and know what they are trustworthy on. I don't know that we will ever get there. And so there might need to be, and AI could be very helpful with this, assessments that you trust a person only on a particular topic, and you only want to pay attention to their assessments when it is pertinent to that topic that you trust them on.
And then
we didn't want to do that at the beginning because it just makes the user interface so much more complicated. And we were trying to understand even how people would work with a simple interface.
And then Devin.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about kind of, I guess the fundamental issue I'm running into is that TrustNet is itself a platform. If this becomes popular, it's going to have CSAM. You're going to have to deal with right to be forgotten. You're going to encounter gray areas that then all of a sudden you have policy decisions, and we've recursed on the problem. And like how to handle bad actors, or is there agreement on who's a bad actor? Even the idea of like how to weight votes could have huge impacts on who ends up being trusted. And so, yeah, how do you kind of address that?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I'll say what I said before, that I see if we do have a centralized entity, I don't want to think of it as a platform that thinks about things for me. I want to think of it as a communication medium. Its only job is that when I ask about a particular piece of content, it delivers to me all the assessments that I want on that piece of content. So it is not storing content. And it should also not be making decisions on my behalf about whether I trust something or not. It should just be trusted to deliver the raw assessments to me, so that my user agent can make the decision about whether I would want to trust that content or not.
If I may, that's illegal. Like,
What do you mean?
The CSAM example, for instance, to operate I mean, unless you're talking about purely peer-to-peer, like a.
Oh, no. The service does not deliver content, right? All it delivers is a set of these people trust it, and these people say it's accurate, and these people say it's inaccurate.
And probably text, which likely won't be CSAM.
I mean, yes, people might be assessing CSAM content, and I have no idea about the sort of legal ramifications of sending an assessment of a piece of CSAM content.
I may be over-indexing on that little text field.
Yeah, but like right to be forgotten, if you can't delete the history of your assessments, then there could be a problem there. So yes, it will be complex.
I think there's something powerful in what you're saying there, David, that ties into this Stratechery article from a few years ago, which I think is really, really important, which describes that moderation, like where you are in the technology stack, has a big influence on what you can do and what the risks of centralization are, right? Like we centralize some aspect of DNS, but we don't. And this, I think this post was written when Cloudflare decided to kill 4chan or something like that.
That's Stormfront,
right?
when they killed Stormfront.
Right, Stormfront. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think there's something really powerful here about when you're deep in the technology stack, you need to aspire to be very neutral. And that's, I think, how we think of Chrome, right? And if you're higher up in the technology stack, like, for example, if you're the provider of a Chrome extension, right, then you don't have as much burden to be neutral because there's more opportunities for choice, right? So, like, the internet routers are very neutral. And then as we move up the stack, you can apply more and more opinions.
Absolutely. And I think I mean, that's why I'm so excited to be talking at a browser conference, right? Like, figuring out what pieces we can enforce neutrality on and then give them more power in the browser because they're neutral, right? I think that could make TrustNet so much better, right? There's real limits to what we can do, with just an extension, which cannot be trusted to have that neutrality, for example.
I think part of your insight is, I don't think we can solve this problem at any one layer of the stack. Right? Like we need more primitives, we need more capabilities at the lower levels of the stack that are neutral capabilities, which then people can then build on top of by
exactly like the neutral capability of associating some kind of identifier with a piece of content so that you can go look up its assessments, right? So that in order to break through the thicket of redirects or fragments or embeds and so on and so forth, that I feel is something that could be done in a neutral way within the browser, but that would then empower tools that use it.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I'm sure this discussion will continue, and I'll find a way to send out notes.
Yeah, so I'd love to be reached out to, and I'm sure Farnaz would as well. You can find both of us on our academic pages. I'm also D. Carter at Google as a visiting faculty researcher.
Great, thank you so much.
Nice meeting everybody.
Bye.